Hey guys, I've had quite a few people looking at the Aeros videos that I was doing ask me to do a comparison, or at least, ask me about what I thought was the difference between the Aeros and the Headrush Looperboard. So what I did is I went out and I bought the Headrush Looperboard so that I could do a good comparison. So the purpose of this video is to do exactly that. Okay, let's get to it. So before we turn them on, the first thing I want you to notice is the difference in size. The Aeros, you could probably have at least 4 Aeros loopers in the space for one Headrush Looperboard. So if size is a concern for you, Aeros wins this particular one. Before we even turn anything on, you can also notice there's 4 switches and an expression wheel on the Aeros. On the Headrush Looperboard, we can see there's lots more switches and knobs. Some will find it as a pro or a con. I'm actually a fan of additional switches so that there's fewer combinations of switches that you have to press to do something. Okay, so let's see what it looks like when we turn them both on. Let's see what the boot time is. Okay, well, you can see it's not an instantaneous boot up. One thing to notice with the difference between the two and the actual switches, they both have physical switches, but the Aeros has a hardware switch. What that means is I can leave it in the on position, and whenever I power the unit from any source, it just comes on automatically. The Looperboard does not have that kind of switch. It's some sort of software trigger. It's not up or down, it's just you push it in. It's a push button power switch. We'll see this in a second, how this affects powering down too. So I already said with the Aeros, you can simply just turn down the power on it, right? But let's see what it looks like when we power it off. It just goes straight off. It's a hardware switch, right? Now, with the Looperboard, when I press it, it actually just brings up an exiting screen. So let's go ahead and exit that. Let's shut it down, and we go to powering off. Now, this can be a good thing because that same screen, if I had unsaved changes, would ask me to save them. Some people might find that to be useful. So if you want something that you don't have to reach down to turn on and off, then the Aeros would win that one. If you want something that, because it has a soft switch, then the Looperboard would probably be better for you because, well, it prevents you from losing information. It prevents you from losing some of your data. So for instance, I'm going to show that example. I just imported some audio. If I press the power switch here, it brings up a screen that asks me if I want to discard the changes, save the new loop, or cancel the shutdown. So let's cancel that shutdown. Now we notice they both have touch screens. Both touch screens are responsive. You can see that the touch screen on the Looperboard is larger. Now, if you are wanting to do a quick start, I would say the advantage goes to the Aeros because of the quick start guide. So they actually have documentation. They have documentation in the unit itself. And not to mention, whenever you go to, let's say, set your settings, you also have these question marks that gives you the documentation. So if you're wanting something which you don't have to read through a bunch of a manual or something, you can actually look at the unit itself. The Aeros is great in that respect. The Headrush doesn't really have anything like that. There's nothing that explains what anything is.
The USB port on the Aeros so far doesn't really do anything that I know about. Whereas the Looperboard, I do know that it can act as an external drive. So you were able to drag and drop file or delete files or clean them up on the Looperboard. Let's also talk about the power supply. The Aeros, I'm pretty sure that you could run the whole thing with one of those larger multi-plug power supplies that powers your whole pedal board. Whereas the Looperboard has that weird combo where it goes from the Looperboard to some transformer box and then to the wall. Now for this comparison video, the first thing to note is that neither one of these units are complete. What I mean by that is that they are continuing to add updates. Now, I forget where I read it on one of these boards, but somebody gave some really wise advice, and they said don't buy equipment based upon what you hope it will do later. Buy it for what it is now.
The second thing to note is that at any time, any of these critiques could actually be affected by an update, which is a great thing about updates, especially if the companies listen to your critiques, is that you can continuously improve the product. With both of these companies, there's a lot of hype and a lot of talk about the promise of the units, and that helps sell them. But it also helps the user to become quite disappointed when they find out that it's not already there. Now, the main problem with the updates is they're actually kind of slow, or at least they have been. Singular Sound says that they've hired more people, and so they're going to accelerate the development. I haven't talked specifically to the Headrush folks what the deal is there, but I do know that it feels really slow. Another difference is the way that updates are done. You can see that on the Aeros, if you connect to Wi-Fi, I can check there for an update. But even better, if there was an update, when I turned it on, it would use the Wi-Fi connection to check with Singular Sound if there was an update, let you know, and ask if you want it to update. Now, the Looperboard, you have to go and download a file and then hook the computer up, and you have to put the Headrush into update mode. You go over here and you go to firmware update, and it'll put you in this mode, and it will sit here. So it sort of reboots it into a update mode. And now you should go to your computer and run the updater. That's a few steps and some chance for things to go a little strange there. I like the way that Aeros has the updates set, where it will take care of all that for you. I think that's great. Now, here's another thing to look at. Let's say we go to the loops. Aeros has a 2x2 mode, and it also has a 6x6 mode. What that means is that, let's say 2x2, you can have 2 song parts, and each of those song parts can have 2 synced tracks. Now those tracks don't have to be the same measure length. If I want to put down a bass line or a rhythm section, but then I have some melody that goes over it that's twice as long or 4 times long or what have you, it means that I don't have to play that bass line for the huge amount. Now the 6x6, that means 6 song parts with 6 synced tracks with that same sort of functionality. They don't have to be the same length, which is great. There's a whole lot of potential there. The main difficulty is that with just these buttons, it's really difficult to deal with that. 2x2 mode's not so bad. I can record, I can play, and if I want to switch to the next part. Now notice here, I don't have the ability to go to the next part but not record. Right, maybe I want to go to the next song part, but I don't want to record just quite yet. Okay. Now, when I go to the next part, now I have really no choice but to just play instead of record. Now, I think there's a trick where I can go to the next song part and record, and that'll start. Now, the next thing for you to notice, let's go to 6x6 mode. Now, this, I think, is kind of a weakness of the Aeros. If you wanted to start recording in this mode, you have to be on the first track to record. And then if you want to record the again, you go to the second track. There's not really an ability to, let's say, go to from the first track to the fourth track when you're recording here, and you can't name the tracks. If you wanted something where it would be the same across different song parts, then you wouldn't be able to do that. Also, if you want to switch song parts, right now the only thing you can do is kind of sequentially go through them. So now I'm on song part 2. Now notice how I can move between the song parts, but I can't go from 2 to 4. Again, it's this idea that you just kind of iterate on to the next one, which doesn't always work for some workflows. You might want to say that certain tracks need to be certain instruments because of the way it would integrate with the rest of your rig. Now, on the Headrush, because of the switches that there are, it is immediately available to me to start any track. So I'm just going to start recording on 2. Alright? Also note on the Looperboard that it supports 5 different looping workflows. So we have fixed, and that's going to be where everything has the same length. I can switch to serial mode, where it's 4 different song parts, one at the other, so they're not going to play in parallel. There's sync, where everything can play in parallel, but they don't have to be the same length. They can be multiples of the first one. There's serial sync, which I know a lot of people have wanted this for the Aeros, where you can have one track that plays continuously, and then your other 3 tracks can be 3 different song parts. And then you have free mode, which is just completely free. Things don't line up or anything like that. Supporting those right out of the box just should make every looper happy, because that's a whole lot of the different workflows that people might use. I know that sometimes I use serial sync. If I'm using a drum machine, then I would be using serial. And sometimes you just want to play around with lots of layers in sync mode. I would do that a lot with the RC505 when I had it. Now, I can go over here and I can change the name of the track. Okay, so let's talk about some other features. They both will take MIDI clock in. There's sort of a different behavior there though. The singular sound, it's really meant to be paired with the singular sound beat buddy, which can send time signature information to the Aeros, and it will pick that up and measure the measures accordingly. But there's a couple of strange things that can happen. If you stop the Aeros, it sort of doesn't know where the beginning of the measure is. So if you try to start it back up, it can be out of sync. With the Looperboard, I noticed when I synced it to the beat buddy, of course, I don't think there was I wasn't getting any time signature information, but what it did do was it did remember where the downbeat was. So if I stopped the Looperboard and then I told it to start back up again, it would wait to the beginning of the next measure to start up. That's great, because sometimes you want the looper to drop out while you play something. That's great functionality. I think that's very live practical. As far as MIDI out, neither one of these have MIDI out. They both right now have MIDI through, which is sad, because I think that the Looperboard would benefit a lot from having a configurable MIDI out that could control, let's say, the beat buddy. And then those two could integrate pretty well. Another MIDI difference. The Looperboard does have a MIDI implementation so you can control it. It's a little bit, well, it's pretty non-standard in the way that they assign the values. So you might have trouble finding MIDI controllers that work well with it out of the box. But it does have that MIDI implementation, whereas the Aeros doesn't really. It will respond to change song part, but you can't specify what it changes to. And also MIDI clock information and the time signature. As far as I can tell, that's all it responds to. Now, they said this should be implemented in the next couple months, but we'll see. Another difference. I feel like the Aeros has much more stable software. I have not encountered any bugs with it. Whereas the Looperboard, there's just all these kind of weird bugs that pop up. There's been a couple times where I've looped and part of the waveform would disappear, or I wouldn't be able to stop it. And I'm not even going to talk about the beta software, but the version that they have right now, that's the official version, has lots of weird bugs. Now, as far as ease of use, they're both pretty easy to use. I would say, though, that I really enjoy having these extra switches. Now, what I like about the switches is that I can play, let's say I play one. Let's have that go. Okay. I can record this one, and it'll switch to it. But I can choose whether to go back to overdubbing that first one, or just simply playing it. Now, it's not intuitive. This says stop undo, but you can go back to playing the other one. Right? So this blinking green. Blinking green. I can go back to playing the other one. I don't have to overdub each time. So I get to choose what I'm planning on doing there. Now here, I'm going to choose to overdub. So when it gets to it, starts the overdubbing. I like that. That's just really live performance friendly. I can expect certain tracks to be in certain places, and I can go directly to them. Now let's talk about customer service, because invariably you're going to have to deal with that at some point. On the forums, when I try to interact with Headrush, it can sometimes take days and days before you hear anything back. I haven't really talked to them hardly at all aside from that. Whereas with Singular Sound, you can go onto their forums and you can talk directly to the CEO himself and their tech people, their developers, and talk to them about your problems and request features. It's Nothing like that over on the Looperboard boards. They seem more reserved. The Looperboard also comes with a set of effects, whereas the Aeros is more streamlined. It's just about looping, which I actually kind of like. I think if you start adding all sorts of effects to a looper, that it starts becoming more like a toy to me. I mean, I don't want to reverse the loops. Sorry if you like it. That's just cheesy to me. That being said, with the Looperboard, they have actual effects like reverb and delay and an amp emulator and compression, things like that. I wouldn't use the amp emulator on the Looperboard. I use a Helix, and I just like that tone a lot better. Because of that, I'm really not concentrating too much on the guitar tones for the Looperboard. I will say this, though. Their compression and EQ and reverb is great for acoustic. I could probably gig with just the Looperboard and not take any of my other stuff if I was doing acoustic work. Now there's also this functionality where I can make changes to my loops all by foot. I can change the length, the speed, I can reverse them, I can fade them, I can transpose them, peel, bounce, or clear them all by foot. So let's say that I want to fade out. I could go over to fade. I can choose particular tracks. It's not going to show them right now because no tracks are playing. But I can do this all by foot. And then if I want to exit that, I can just click that button again. So I have live control over some cool looping functions. This all allows me to have quite a bit of live control right at my feet.
The Aeros has something like that for track volumes and muting. Let's take a look at that. Now, let me just create a couple of tracks here in 6x6 mode. Let's say I have 4 tracks in 6x6 mode. Okay, what I can do is I can hold down this bottom left, and it will bring me to a page that shows me the individual volume levels. Now, I can move between the 4 tracks or even master and use this wheel right here, which is actually really kind of cool to control the volumes. Also, I can mute individually. Okay, and exit. Okay, when it is running, I can also double tap on the overdub or the record or play, and it will mute that track that I'm on. Now, note that I still need to move to the right track. This is somewhat problematic because there's not MIDI in implementation into the Aeros yet, so you find yourself doing lots of tap dancing in order to get to the right track, to mute it, or overdub, or to undo.
Another thing that's a difference between the two is that out of the box, the Looperboard comes with some drum backing tracks. Now, they sound good, but they're not tweakable in terms of their tempo. When you import it, the tempo isn't what it says it is, and they're static backing tracks. There's no fills, dynamic fills. You don't choose different parts for verse and chorus or anything like that. It's just the same thing. Whereas the Aeros Looper, it doesn't come out with any drums or anything like that, but it really is made to be partnered with the Singular Sound Beat Buddy, which has some cool functionality like to be able to add dynamic fills and also set different drum patterns for the verse and the chorus and the bridge and any number of other song parts, which that is pretty cool. That can keep it not feeling like static drum machine, but as something else that you play along with your music. As far as inputs and outputs, there's a little bit of feelings of deception on Headrush's part, and maybe it wasn't intentional, but people were assuming that when they said that it was stereo, that meant stereo loops. Instead, you have mono loops, and there's 16-bit, I think 48 kilohertz, something like that. It's whatever around what CD quality is. It's that, but they're mono. When they say stereo, what they mean is that you can choose to pan them to either side. So you could create 2 tracks and pan one to left, one to right or something. That's not stereo looping. Whereas the Aeros has stereo looping, which I like because you can do some really lush. On the Aeros, not only is it stereo looping, but it's also 24-bit. It's got higher quality of sound. You can really hear the difference in bits to me in terms of the dynamic range and how far down the noise floor is. I feel there's a bit more dynamic range in the Aeros. The Looperboard does have more modes. It has a total of 5 modes
fixed, serial, sync, and free. Whereas the Aeros can be made to have serial, sync, and free. That being said, each song part in the Aeros is sort of like running sync mode on the looper board, but you have 6 instances of those because of the 6 song parts. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is show a sync mode on both the Aeros and the looper board. Let's take a look at the Aeros first. We're going to be doing this without a MIDI clock. What I can do at any point is I can choose to mute something, right? I can go to the next track. I can also hold down this and mute selected tracks, right? I can also reduce or lower the volume. If I wanted to, I could go to the master track and do a fade out. Right? Okay, so that's running sync mode on the Aeros. Okay, now let's look at running sync mode on the looper board. Okay, so we can choose to start on any of the tracks. We don't have to go in order or anything like that on the looper board. Let's check that out. So you can see how that works. Pretty straightforward sync mode. You notice that you can have various lengths. Now, they all have to start at the beginning at some point altogether. Well, that's the main loop, and I think that's an okay compromise to make. It's an okay issue to have, really. Now, with all of those, you are able to overdub. Let me just show you an example of that. Now, you also notice I can turn these on individually. And at any point, I can turn some off. So there, I just turned 2 on and 3 off. Now I'm going to overdub something on here. Normally, but I just wanted to show you, if you listen, it's been overdubbed. Now the overdubbing starts immediately, whereas the regular playing doesn't. The regular playing and recording doesn't. Okay. So one downside on the Aeros is for serial mode is if you're wanting to do freeform, if you're wanting to just sort of go with whatever length there is without being MIDI synced in its current software form, there's I think probably a bug in that it won't sync to the start when you're switching song parts, only within a single song part. Let me show you. You see how it already switched to the new song part, even though I wasn't at the end of my first song part. This would get in the way of being able to use this serial mode without MIDI clock involved. Now, if you're running the Beat Buddy, this isn't a problem because it will ensure that you wait until the next measure. But that's just something to know about. So now we're going to try, because of that particular issue, we're going to try running the Beat Buddy to essentially serial mode. In 6x6, you have to do several taps to tell it where you want it to go back to, and then you can actually trigger the change. Now, the nice thing about this is there's actually a lot of tracks here, right? So if I wanted to have, let's say, create a bridge section, I can switch to that. It just takes additional taps right now until Single Sound releases the MIDI update. There's really not an easy way to synchronize song part changes between the Looperboard and the Aeros. But there you go. That's essentially serial mode. Now, unlike the Looperboard, or at least not visually, you can add in many more layers even when you're running this mode. For instance, exactly something I would listen to very often, that extra set of bad notes. But you can see that I can add more of these and still have control over muting. So let's get rid of that one. All right. Okay, so that's serial mode. Okay, so let's try doing serial mode. Now, pardon the flubs there, but you do notice something. You notice that there is a little bit of a glitch with the waveform, and that's sort of what I'm talking about with the Looperboard. It's got a lot of cool features, but there's just various rough edges where they obviously have some bugs they need to fix. In serial mode, you can use all 4 tracks, but there's also something on a Looperboard that the Aeros doesn't have, and that's serial sync mode. You can kind of do this if you use the beat buddy as your drums, and so you have this constant drums going in the background, and then the other tracks that can play along with it. But let's show off the serial sync mode. Serial sync mode, you can use one track as your track that plays all the time. So you can make like a rhythm track, for instance. And I can play something over that. Second song part, and the drums will still stay there. I can even add in a third part, but first I'm going to go back to that first part. Now I'm going to add the third part. That as a once over, lead it into something else. You see how that works. Now, the nice thing here, you have these two sets of switches for each track, is that I can choose just to play, or I can choose to go straight into overdubbing at any point. So the same buttons that stop also play it if it is stopped already. If you hold it down, it'll undo a layer. I think it's super practical for live use. There's a whole lot less tap dancing on the looper board than the Aeros for basic looping. Now, they both have free mode, just completely free with no matching up of the measure of the clip ends. But since that's not something I really use, I'm just going to skip that. I don't think I'd be able to do that justice.
So let's talk about my conclusion here. I think these are both good loopers with a lot of promise. They're both usable now. I don't know, if I had to choose one, I think it would be kind of hard. I like the form factor of the Aeros. Also, it's been a while. I'm really waiting to have that MIDI control so that I can choose which track to go to. Because when you're playing with any other device, like I have a drum sequencer that I need to switch between patterns. If I have 1 and 6 there doing certain things, and I need to switch between 1 and 6, I want the looper to switch between song parts 1 and 6 also. That's just playing well with other devices. The looper board, I really want them to have the MIDI output so that I can have the switches send MIDI signals out. But anyways, if I had to choose, I don't think it's an easy decision because I like the Aeros, the size, the form factor. It seems to be rock solid, no bugs. But I like the control and practicality of a lot of features on the looper board. The additional switches, some of the effects that I could use just so I could gig with just it, the different modes of looping. So I think it's going to depend on the particular loop artist. If you're looking for something that's small that can fit on an existing board, you can practice and you can do things with and play out with, but you have a big existing board, the Aeros is probably going to work better for you. There'll be a few more taps to get certain places, but it's gonna work for you better. If you're wanting to gig with maybe just a couple pedals and a looper, or maybe just a looper, the Headrush is pretty compelling. So I'm not going to tell you which one to get. I think there's pros and cons. That being said, I think both of these units are better than anything else out there on the looping market. I'm wondering how Boss is going to respond to both of these, but I think they're both pretty compelling, and I think it's going to depend on your use case, which one you'd like better. Now, if you have any questions, feel free to add them down to the comment. I'll do my best to answer them. Also, don't forget to subscribe. Check out my other videos. Thank you. You guys stay safe in all this COVID-19 mess.